And welcome back to Carcon Carne. I'm James Van Hustle, still held here in captivity. And I should plug, before we get into this second episode tonight, I should plug the other podcast I do. I work for 101 WKQX in Chicago. And one of the things I do there is the History of Alternative podcast. I co host it with the impossibly handsome John Manley. And every week we talk about a different aspect of alternative music history. And this week, since it is the anniversary of the birth of David Bowie and also the anniversary of the death of David Bowie, we go deep into all things Thin White Duke. If you're interested in Bowie at all or the history of alternative, it's an hour-long conversation covering really every angle of Bowie, from Space Oddity through Black Star. And so that's out there. I just wanted to give a quick plug for the other podcast I do. Tomorrow night on this here podcast, I'll be joined by Sketchbook Brewing. I've said it before, I love the entrepreneurial spirit and energy. It's very indie rock, the craft brewing scene in and around the city and suburbs. Sketchbook Brewing, Evanston, Skokie, very much a big part of the north suburbs. We'll be talking to them for the Friday night edition of Carcon Carne. My guest tonight, he is an author. He is a movie writer, producer, and director. He's also someone I've known for 30 freaking years. He is author and filmmaker Marc Fienberg. Good evening, Marc.
Hello, how are you doing?
30 years. I said this right before we went on, Marc, and people may not appreciate this. You have inexplicably reversed the aging process. You've somehow become younger in some Faustian pact that you've made. You've not aged.
Yeah, well, that's nice of you to say, even though it's not true, but I appreciate you saying it. And right back at you, by the way.
I have gray hair. You're being nice. I have gray hair.
You're much more mature though than you were before.
Thank you. Well, that's 100% true. So your newish book, recently released book, Dad's Great Advice for Teens. Teenagers are tricky. I was an awful one.
Yes.
And when it comes to sharing the lessons of right and wrong, sometimes we as parents mess that up. So here's your new book. It's here to help. Right out of the gate, Marc, why should teens listen to you?
Yeah. Well, let's be upfront. They're not going to listen to anybody, really. So it's futile just from the get-go. But I will tell you that while my teens won't listen to me, your teens certainly might be more apt to listen to me. You know, they don't want to listen to their own parents, but if you buy a book and you leave it on their pillow, they just might read it. And listen, I have 25 pieces of great advice in my book, plus maybe 7 extra. And if they listen to 2 or 3 or 4 of them, that's a success for me. It's a success for the parents. Everybody's happy.
So the book is out now, and this is part of what will be an ongoing series of great advice books, which I love the concept. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things I found in reading the book. First off, as an adult, full props to you. There are lessons here I can take away as an adult. There are lessons here that any adult can learn from. I mean, these are kind of universal truths.
Well, not necessarily universal to everybody, but I agree. There's I didn't realize at the time, but what happens is most of the people buying this book are parents, and they're reading it first, and they're taking advice from it, and then giving it to their kids if they approve of it. And as a result, once I figured this out, my next book is obviously going to be Dad's Great Advice for Parents of Teens. But yeah, hopefully they're universal. But you can't appeal to everybody. The one thing I get pushback on the most, which nobody agrees on, is talking about sex in a book. Number one, a lot of people don't want a book teaching their kids about sex at all. And number two, a lot of people don't like what I have to say about it. It's a little bit controversial out there, but I said it because that's what teens got to hear, I think.
I agree. I didn't pick up a trace of controversy as I read that. I'm like, oh, this is really this important stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't pretend that kids don't have sex. We can't pretend that that's not part of dating and romance at the teen level. And
well, you still hear a lot of dads out there. I was one of them, actually. The genesis of that piece of advice, and the piece of advice is, listen to your heart, listen to your brain, and when you're ready to have sex, not your parents, not your friends, not your boyfriend or girlfriend, not your preacher, not your rabbi. But the impetus for that advice was not from me. It was from another dad that I interviewed. And, I was saying I have 3 girls. This is when they were younger. And I'm like, well, I'm going to keep them locked up from dating until they're 35. And he looked at me and he said, did you have sex when you were a teen or a young adult? And I said, yeah. And he's like, did you, have a bad experience or a good experience? Were you ready for it? And I'm like, yeah, it was fine. And he said, don't you want that for your own child, like girl or boy? And you can't argue with that.
Nope.
You want your kids to be happy. If it comes down to that, that's
You
what.
want them to be happy, and you also preach safety. I mean, you talk about safe sex, you talk
Yes.
about condoms. I mean, you talk about doing it when it's right for you, but also being smart about it and being safe and being respectful.
Yeah,
And
that's the
there's
new.
nothing controversial about any of those things.
Well, you'd be, it's there's some religious people out there who are still, save yourself for marriage, which, listen, if that's what you want to teach your kids, then great. But as we know, what you teach your kids and what your kids end up doing are two different things. And, you cannot, no matter what kind of parent you are, you really can't stop your kid from having sex if they want to have sex. And, just teach them. The new thing I'm pushing that I've heard from other parents is, it used to be save yourself for marriage. Now I say save your condom virginity for marriage. Don't, make that your thing. Don't have sex without a condom until you're married. So, that is a little bit more realistic for some kids now, and it's teaches safe sex. So
There's one, you put forth a lot of umbrella topics, and they're all perfectly valid and wonderful. There's one, you really could have just made this the book.
yeah,
Don't do really dumb things.
yeah,
That's it.
number one.
Done.
That is.
Thanks for buying the book. I'm
It's
Marc
true.
Fienberg.
That's true. That's not great for sales, but it is true. Like it's dad's great advice. Number one is don't do really dumb things. But here's the flaw with that argument, James. As it turns out, most teens need a little bit more definition and direction than just don't. You'd think just telling them not to do really dumb things is enough, but you really have to very closely define what a really dumb thing is, because it's not so obvious to many of them. So that's what a lot of the rest of the book is.
Other advice you give.
Yeah.
This is interesting. Be a creator, not a consumer. I can read this, and I did read this, but I can read it in so many different ways. This to me is fantastic pandemic era advice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, just kind of a happy accident, because that wasn't the intent when you went into this. But instead of watching TV or Netflix or Hulu for endless hours,
Yeah.
create.
Yeah.
Follow your muse.
Exactly. Exactly. And by the way, though, I like kids always interpret that, even parents interpret that as, you have to be an artist, right? If you have to be interested in music or drawing or some sort of art. But I think you need to translate it into a wider spectrum of just, instead of sitting around consuming all these things that you enjoy, in a lazy sort of passive way, be one of the people that is doing the thing you want to do, right? And start doing it. So for one or two of my kids, that means, art being artistic and drawing. But for another one of my children, that means, starting a business. She loved 3D modeling. I don't know how she got into 3D modeling, but she did.
That's so cool.
And she started it. She got a 3D printer and she started a business doing 3D modeling. So, would I call that art? I mean, not in the traditional sense, but she's using her creativity,
Yeah.
And that's what matters. You probably know this. The most popular TED Talk of all time. Have you seen it?
No.
It was by a guy named Sir. I forget his name, but it's literally the number one. It has almost 100 million views, and it's all about how schools are sucking the creativity out of our children, and they're teaching them, you need to be right and not wrong. Right is good. Don't make mistakes and get good grades. And so kids don't want to take chances, and kids don't want to be creative and try new things and all that. And it's a very convincing argument that, creativity, even if you go into accounting or finance or business or whatever, creativity is what sets you apart from all the other, people looking for that job that you're trying to get. So it's I think an important one.
And along those lines, another thing you advise, and I totally agree with this, fail on your way to success.
Yeah. That's
Make
tied to it.
mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we put especially parents put a lot of pressure on their kids to get straight A's and do it all right. But, you learn a lot from the mistakes, as long as you learn from the mistakes. Right. But, and if you're not, if you're not taking chances, then you're not pushing yourself. And kids, like the cost of taking a risk as a kid, it seems so much, it seems so high when you're a kid, like to
Yes.
put yourself out there, probably scarier than when you're an adult. But, you know, when you look back and you realize, oh my God, I should have taken more risk, because my friends will laugh at me for, 10 days. Who cares? So I think that's a big one that people have responded to too.
As we're recording this interview, we're also airing it live on Facebook. Dan Schwimmer just said, just ordered it. Look at that. We made a sale.
Look at that.
I wish I had like a bell,
Well, yeah. James, I'll send you the commission.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you, Dan, for watching, listening, and hope you enjoy the book and hope your kids get something out of it.
Yeah. Email me, Dan. I'm happy to send an autographed copy to your kids. Now you got to buy.
And Dan, he's not kidding. His email address is all over the book.
It is. That's true.
Mark made himself wide open for correspondence, which is awesome. We do live in a time when I was talking about this on the History of Alternative podcast. We live in this time where we have unprecedented access to the people who create art. Yeah. It's really, I love it. I think it's fantastic. I love the fact that I can read your book and send you an email about it. I love it that I can listen to a band that I'm into and send them a message on Bandcamp or Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah, there's a lot of disadvantages of our social networking and technology, but that's one of the advantages, I think.
I love bringing everyone down to that same level. I think it's punk rock.
Well, so it's the equivalent of interacting. When a band is out at a concert, they get to interact with their audience. Now you can, writers can do it remotely. Like before, you write a book and you never watch someone read it.
Right.
But now I can interact and get feedback. And I, by the way, you mentioned I have my email in the book a lot. I throw myself out there, and I've invited people to question my great advice, and I've challenged them. If they come up with a good rebuttal, I'm going to put it in the next edition, and I'll have my advice. And then here's David's rebuttal that says my advice is, full of crap.
I love it. That's high level crowdsourcing going on right there.
Yeah, it is a little bit of crowdsourcing, but I don't, there's dads out there. Like, you asked me, how do I know this stuff? I'm a dad. I have done a lot of studying of positive psychology and parenting, and, read a lot and study a lot, but I don't have all the answers. There's a lot of other dads out there that are brilliant in what they do. So
we're all doing our best.
We all, well, we hope we're all
we hope we all are. Exactly. Yeah. So I mentioned the pandemic, and we're in this insane time, and we're in this time where our teens can turn on the TV on a Wednesday and see the Capitol building under siege. Our kids are homeschooled in front of Zoom all day. Truly times like we've never experienced before. What advice do you give kids who are just trying to figure everything out as they're inundated with this news cycle that is ferocious and never ending?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is it is probably tougher on them than it is for us as adults, I think, just because 90% of being a teen is being social, right? And even younger kids. But the couple things that I've been hitting home with my kids are, I try and point out to them how extremely unique these times are, right? The pandemic alone, this hasn't happened in 100 years at least. And I would venture to say that even back then, it wasn't like the whole world mobilized in a couple of weeks and said, all right, we're all quarantining, right? This is like something that has never happened in the history of mankind. And I try and let them know, like, this is something unique for mom and I too, not just you guys. And then you overlap that with, the kind of presidency we've had for the last 4 years, which, no matter your political party, you have to say it's been a unique 4 years. And I kind of remind them of that too. Like, there has not been a presidency like this before, and there has not been people storming the Capitol like this. And this is all like crazy stuff. And then you say, this too shall pass, right? Like, it does get better. And even now, like, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, right? We have a vaccine that people are getting. And so, at least now we can say, all right, in March, April, May, June, July, you'll have the vaccine and life will go back to whatever normal is going to be when we get back to it. So I think those are the sort of things that I tell my kids. And then I also remind them, listen, the stakes are pretty high. You talked about dad's great advice. Number one, don't do really dumb things. Part of the message there is, it's when you're trying to figure out if something's really stupid, you look at how probable it is that you'll get caught or get hurt, right? And then the consequences of that. And then what I tell kids is throw away the probability, because you're awful at deciding what the probability is. Whatever you think the probability is, it's 1,000 times higher than you think. The police are definitely going to show up, and you think they won't, but they will. And I say, just look at the consequences. And for, a pandemic, the consequences are you could die yourself, you could kill your parents, you could kill your grandparents, you could kill someone that you just run into on the street. And it's worth staying home to avoid that. So that's what I try to remind them. But listen, it sucks for them. What are you going to do?
Yeah, I mean, the best I can, and I've shared a lot of similar advice. I mean, the best I can do is just keep checking in, because
Yeah.
I know as an adult, my opinions, my mental health, my wellness can turn on a dime during all this.
Yeah.
I mean, day by day. I mean, every hour can be different. So I think the best thing I've been able to do is just do constant checks. You doing all right? Anything you want
Yeah.
to talk about? So because it is so weird, and they don't have that social outlet.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, I remember when we were kids. I mean, that was everything. It
Yeah.
still is everything. But
And listen, and then you sort of work on creative ways of getting them, the best that you can, meaning you make it easy for them to do Zoom meetings. My youngest son, he used to have a game, he could play games for X number of hours a day. Now, there's a new rule, as long as he's playing with a friend, over the internet that he's talking to, he can play an unlimited amount of Minecraft, which is crazy how much he's taken advantage of that. But he's playing with his friend, and so he's not locked in his room all alone, and so that worked, right? Once we go back to normal, hopefully we'll push him towards some different types of interactions. But for now, that's the bone we can throw him, and so you try and find that stuff.
by the way, I'm not chugging a beer as we're talking. I'm drinking the
Sure,
Lagunitas. It's the Lagunitas Hoppy Refresher. It's their carbonated hoppy drink. This is delicious.
James, I know you're from high school. I'd venture to say you might have been one of those people that pour the beer into the Coke can. No, you didn't know that trick?
We just did it in the car. Went home
Okay.
during lunch break. It's,
You didn't even, okay. It was much more easy.
but I mean, that kind of opens the door. When we were younger, I feel like things pre-internet, pre-mobile phones, things were so much looser. There were a lot more leaps of faith that had to be taken by parents with their teenagers. The culture is so different with kids now, with going out. I mean, you talk about, the cops will show up even if you don't think so. Are kids finding their way to as much trouble as we did when we were young?
I don't know. I mean, I think some things have gotten easier for them and some things have gotten a lot harder. Like if you think about, how when you got lost or ran out, like you didn't have a cell phone back then and you were really in trouble, right? Like you had to go find a stranger. So, and they don't have that, and we can track their phones and know where they are at all times. But, the pressure from social media now, like when we went to high school, we just had to worry about the jerks at the high school bullying us and making fun of us. And now, it's the whole world that could make fun of and bully a kid.
Right. The speed of the internet.
Yeah. And as a parent, I think it was much easier for our parents to know what was going on in our lives, because they could hear us on the phone or what. Now, I think with Snapchat and like my son could be texting some 50-year-old fat guy in Venezuela
Or Minsk.
yeah, I mean, I don't even want to think about it. So, and it's really hard you don't want to track that stuff, ideally, and it's hard to do it anyway. So that's kind of the stuff that scares me is, finding out that there could be, if your kid is smart about it, and they don't have to be that smart about it, they could hide some potentially really big problems, and you won't know their problems until, your kid flies off to Venezuela.
Fair. One thing you bring up, a lot of your topics follow this theme of finding oneself, finding your own place in the universe. And it's most evident with don't please your parents.
Yeah.
That is solid advice.
I'm glad you say that. That has gotten a lot of parents upset. They're like, they're supposed to make their children happy, that your parents happy, and But no, I think it's a recipe for disaster. I think it's terrible. But a lot of parents do not agree with you and I on this one. It's you
That,
know,
that's weird insecurity talking there, because we're talking about people, kids finding their way and figuring out who they are and their place and what
yeah.
they love, where their passions are.
I think it's easier. I think it's easier for parents to do that in the career aspect. I think a lot of parents are not putting as much pressure on their kids to be doctors or lawyers or whatever they
Mhm.
envision their kids being. I think it's that we haven't made as much progress in putting pressure on their love life and their love interests. I think a lot of parents still want their kids to marry within their faith or their culture or some other restrictive group. And I think that falls into the same category. I mean, I tell a story of a close friend of mine from college. She was a traditional Indian woman and came from a traditional Indian family, and a lot of pressure on her to marry within the Indian culture. And her brother was the same way. But she fell in love with a Cuban guy, and she kept it secret for 5 years. And her brother married a traditional Indian woman in a sari with a bindi and all that. She finally revealed herself to her family, married the Cuban guy. They kind of shunned him a little bit, but eventually accepted him. Skip to 5 years later, the traditional Indian woman that the brother had married was the worst woman in the world, treated the family terribly, stole from the family, treated the parents awful. She was a terrible person. They ended up divorced. And the Cuban gentleman was a mensch and treated everybody like a queen and had the most respect for everybody. And the parents came around and they said, you know, we're sorry. Like they put this one little label of being this culture ahead of find a good person to marry. So it's tough to do as a parent, I think, for a lot of people.
Is this lesson of don't please your parents something hard learned on your end? Like, did you have to figure this out for yourself in your relationship with your parents?
Luckily, no. I think maybe I focused on this because my parents, I think, were pretty good at not pushing us in that direction. And it was obvious to me that we were the exception to the rule. I ran into a lot of other friends who were studying pre-med. And I'm like, you hate it. Why are you doing it? Like, my parents want me to be a doctor. I'm like, well, do they know you're miserable? They're like, yeah. They're like, well, so why? Like, they want me to be a doctor. I'm like, they don't care that you're miserable. And they're like, no, that's what they want. And I'm like, well, what do you want? They're like, I feel obligated to give my parents what they want because they gave me, a good childhood or whatever. And I understand the thinking. I just think it makes for miserable kids. What I say in the book is kids that try and make their parents happy end up as adults who are trying to make their parents happy. And most of those adults end up as adults talking to therapists about, constantly trying to make their parents happy.
Talking about finding oneself, explain what contradistinctive is, because this is a topic that comes up in the book.
Yeah.
This is a fancy way to say something else.
It's a fancy way to say be different, right? Contradistinctive just means being different. And by the way, I didn't come up with that. That was my daughter. She's the nerdy one, and I'm like, that's great. So you learn something from your kids. But I didn't give her credit in the book. Sorry. Um, so yeah, it just means it's sort of similar to the other thing we talked about, which is take chances. And one of those chances you have to take is don't be afraid to be yourself because it sucks. When we were in school, I know there was at least 5 kids that came out of the closet 10, 20 years later
Yeah.
because they weren't safe. And it's not like we came from this urban high school. It was a somewhat safe high school. And back then kids didn't feel comfortable being themselves if they were LGBTQ. And it's awful. I mean, kids commit suicide over that. And
Yeah.
so that's one of the more extreme examples. But even my kids, they feel peer pressure to like a certain band or like somebody on TikTok when they don't really, but their friends like it. And it's no way to grow up hiding what you're truly after. I mean, you shouldn't have to apologize for it, and as long as it's not illegal or hurting somebody. you gotta be yourself. So, and I'll tell you, I come from a community now. I live on the West Coast now, where my friend, my daughter has a friend who, when she was in 8th grade, decided she was a boy and identified as a boy. And when she went to high school, she she changed her name, and she changed her pronouns, and and it was a seamless transition for him, I should say. I'm still not good with it. But it was an amazing thing to see, like in just one generation, how comfortable kids can be changing their gender, at that age, at that young age, and not be bullied for it. And like, just the happiness it brings a kid to do that. So that to me is a positive step.
For sure. Okay, so the book, Dad's Great Advice for Teens, it is a quick, really smart read. And you said it at the beginning of the interview. This is something maybe you just leave with your kids. Maybe don't say, here's a book that you need to read. I think if you just leave it somewhere obvious, they'll dig into it and they'll tear through it. And this isn't heavy-handed. It's not ham-fisted in any way. This is smart stuff. And it's told in, this is to your credit as a writer. I mean, it's told in a very relatable way. You're young at heart, which is another point you make in the book. Don't grow up too fast. And clearly you haven't.
Yeah, I haven't grown up at all, obviously. I mean, both my good looks and my maturity level, right? Which
Dude,
is
I'm right there with you. I'm wearing a band hoodie. I've got records behind me. I just ate some cherry sours. I had some pink lemonade before. I'm right there with you. I'm in no hurry.
Well, I mean, why should we, right? There's nothing better than acting like a teenager every once in a while.
Exactly. Before I let you go, I mentioned at the onset, at the beginning, previously on Carco and Carney, I mentioned that you are a writer, a director, a producer of films. Play the Game in 2009. It was a high watermark for you. You wrote it, you directed it. And while it's true that Andy Griffith was in it, Doris Roberts was in it, Clint Howard was in it.
Yeah,
Eaglebauer from Rock and Roll High School. You got Clint Howard in the movie.
yeah. I've always been a fan of his, and
who hasn't? I love Clint Howard.
I know he's great. He's great, and he's a fantastic actor and person. He is just funny and wacky, and just a great person. Just fantastic.
So
And his father, by the way, was in the movie too.
Who was?
His father. We needed to cast another role, and he said, "Why don't you cast my dad?" And I'm like, "Make it happen, dude!" Like, I called up his dad, and next thing you know, his father's in the movie too. It was fantastic.
And this was one of Andy Griffith's last roles.
It was his last role.
It was his last role.
Yeah.
Dang.
Yeah. It was sad. Very sad.
This was a hugely successful movie. This was one of the most successful independent flicks of that year. So with this new direction in publishing, with these great advice books that you have planned, you have this one out, Dad's Great Advice for Teens. Does that take your eye off filmmaking for a little bit? Are you kind of double dipping right now? How are you balancing things?
You got to juggle it all, right? You gotta keep it all going. So I still do that. In fact, I'm very close to, we just had a very good day last week, and got a big investor signed on. So we're almost there. If you got $20 to throw in the next movie, James, call me and let me know.
I can find 20.
I forget Mr. Schwimmer's name who bought my book. Have him call me and you can invest in the next movie. No, I'm still working on movies. It's a much slower process. It's a very, very difficult, slow. It's a totally different world. The Hollywood industry doesn't have the same rules that we're used to, but it's fun. It's interesting, and it's creative. So yeah, I still do that, and I still consult to other movies as well. So I've been keeping busy in that area too.
You're living your best life, Marc Fienberg.
I hope so. We'll see. Thank you.
All right. So again, if you're listening, if you're watching, the book is Dad's Great Advice for Teens. And I mean, true to form, it's truth in advertising. It's great advice for teens.
I hope so. I'm glad you say that. Let me know what your teens say, though. That's the key.
I think my oldest teen might be too cool to read it.
Yeah.
My younger teen, freshman in high school, this will be perfect.
All right. Well, when you see a total turnaround in her behavior, just give the credit to me where it's due. Right.
She's developing a bit of a snarky edge. for the life of me, I don't know where she gets it from. And
Yeah, where does she get it?
we're going to need to hammer that out somehow. So maybe it's the Marc Fienberg book that'll set her down the path of righteousness. Marc, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really fun. I appreciate it. It was great getting back in touch.